The cold wind bit into the skin, a reminder of how harsh the world had become. Snowflakes floated gently in the air, falling softly onto the snow-covered ground, adding to the blanket of cold that had overtaken the city. Two tiny figures huddled together outside a restaurant, their small hands cupped in front of their mouths, hoping to catch the heat from the window just beyond. Their faces were pale, the sharpness of their cheekbones more apparent than the innocence they should have had at their age. Their clothes were ragged and torn, the thin fabric barely offering any protection against the chill. One of them, a twin with long, messy hair, held a faded doll close to her chest, its fabric worn thin from years of use. The other girl clutched a small, tattered scarf, its edges frayed, tied loosely around her neck. Their eyes, filled with sorrow, scanned the restaurant window as the people inside enjoyed hot meals, warm and comfortable, while they stood in the cold. They were hungry. The girl with the doll looked up at her sister, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Do you think they'll give us something?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," the other twin whispered back, her eyes distant, focused on the warm meals inside. "Maybe if we ask, they'll give us leftovers. We don't need much, just a little." They were too young to understand the full weight of their situation, too small to carry the burden of hunger and loss that had been placed on them. But they knew enough to know that there was no one to turn to, no one who cared. They moved closer to the restaurant door, pressing their faces against the glass, hoping to catch a glimpse of something warm, a piece of bread, a scrap of food, anything. Then as they stood there, cold and silent, a soft growl broke through the stillness of the night. It was deep, low, and almost protective in nature. The twins turned, startled, their wide eyes locking onto the figure of a soldier standing just behind them. He was older than they expected, his camouflage military uniform covered in snow, his face weary, his posture bent from the weight of his years. A loyal German shepherd canine stood at his side, its fur matted with ice, its eyes alert, scanning the street. The soldier had seen them before, lingering by the restaurant, unnoticed by most of the world. His eyes softened as he studied the twins, the sadness in their eyes reminding him of his own struggles, of the pain that had shaped him into the man he was today. "Are you hungry?" the soldier asked, his voice deep and rough, the weight of his own pain evident in his words. The twins looked up at him, hesitant, unsure. Their small voices were barely audible. "Please, can we have some food?" the twin with the doll asked, her hands trembling. "We don't want much, just a little bit." The soldier's heart clenched at the sight of their faces, so small, so vulnerable. He glanced at the canine whose gaze was fixed on the girls, unwavering in its loyalty. Without a word, the soldier motioned for the twins to follow him. They hesitated, unsure of whether to trust him, but then one of the twins stepped forward, her hand reaching out to take his. "I'll make sure you're fed," the soldier said, his voice softer now. "You don't need to beg for leftovers. No one should have to do that." He led them around the corner of the restaurant, away from the warm glow of the lights, and into a narrow alley where the air was colder, but at least there was no one watching. The K9 trotted ahead, its tail wagging slightly, sensing the relief that was about to come. Before they could speak again, the soldier bent down to his pack, opening it to pull out some bread and a small container of stew. "This is all I have," he said, his voice filled with a strange gentleness. "But it's enough." The twins watched in silence as he handed them the food, the warmth of it almost too much for them to bear. They hadn't felt warmth like this in so long. Their hands shook as they took the food, tears welling up in their eyes. "Thank you," the twin with the doll whispered. Her voice broke, and the other twin wrapped her arm around her in comfort, both of them leaning into the soldier's quiet presence. "Thank you," the second twin repeated. "Thank you for not turning us away." The soldier nodded, his throat tight. He knew what it was like to have nothing, to feel abandoned, alone, and lost. But he had found something in these two, something worth protecting, something that made him want to do more than just survive. As the twins ate, the K9 sat at attention, watching them with the unwavering loyalty of a companion who had seen the worst of the world and still believed in the goodness of others. The bond between the soldier and his dog was unspoken, but it was strong. They were partners, a team built on trust, sacrifice, and protection. But there was more to this moment. The twins had reminded the soldier of something he had nearly forgotten, that even in the darkest times there was still humanity, still kindness, still hope. Before we begin, let me know where you are watching from. Leave your country name in the comments below. And if you love stories about courage, loyalty, and community, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next stories. As the twins finished their meal, one of them whispered, "We're not alone anymore, right?" The soldier looked down at them, his eyes softening with the realization that no, they weren't, and neither was he. But before they could speak again, a distant sound broke the quiet moment, the heavy footsteps of someone approaching through the alley, fast and forceful, closing in on them. The soldier's heart skipped a beat. The K9 growled, its hackles raised as it turned toward the sound. The twins looked up at the soldier, eyes wide with fear. They could sense, it too, danger was coming. "Stay close," the soldier said, his voice low and steady. "I won't let anything happen to you." And just as they braced themselves, the figure stepped out of the shadows. The shadow looming ahead grew closer with each step, its outline becoming clearer in the blinding storm. Mark's instincts kicked in, his grip tightening around his rifle as he glanced at the twins huddled behind him. Their faces were pale with fear, their bodies trembling, not from the cold, but from the threat they all now faced. The soldier's loyal German Shepherd K9 growled low, its ears flattened against its head, sensing the danger. The dog moved instinctively to protect, standing guard between Mark and the approaching figure. "Stay behind me," Mark whispered to the girls, his voice barely audible over the sound of the wind. He could feel the tension in the air, the storm outside, matching the one inside his chest. He had promised to protect them, and he was about to keep that promise no matter the cost. The footsteps grew louder, and soon the figure was standing just a few feet away, a man in a long, dark coat, his face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. His eyes gleamed coldly, studying the scene with an eerie calm. Mark's hand hovered over the rifle, his muscles coiled with readiness. This was no ordinary person. The way he moved, the way he seemed to materialize out of nowhere, spoke of someone with ill intentions. "Not a smart place to hide, Sergeant," the man said, his voice low and clipped. "You're drawing too much attention." Mark didn't flinch. "I don't need your advice," he replied, his voice firm, carrying the weight of every fight he'd ever fought. "What do you want?" The man smiled. No warmth, no humanity in it. "What I want is simple. The girls. Hand them over." Mark stood tall, his rifle now in his hands, aimed at the man. "You'll have to go through me first." The man's smile widened, as if he were enjoying a game, as if Mark were nothing more than a piece on a chessboard. He stepped closer, his hand reaching into his coat. Mark's heart raced, but he didn't waver. His training kicked in, his body moved with practiced ease, sliding into the position to take a shot if necessary. But the K9 was the first to react. With a fierce growl it lunged, its teeth bared, and its body coiled to strike. The man's eyes flashed with surprise as the K9 collided with him, knocking him to the ground. Mark acted quickly, stepping forward, his rifle raised, eyes locked on the fallen man. But before he could pull the trigger, the man twisted, pulling a knife from beneath his coat and slashing at the dog's side. "No!" Mark shouted, rushing forward, but the K9 was already back on its feet, snapping at the man's arm, pushing him further away. The soldier fired once, hitting the man in the shoulder. He didn't go down immediately. He staggered back, his hand clutching at the wound. his face twisted, in pain and fury, but there was something more in his eyes now, fear. "I'll take them whether you want me to or not," the man growled, his voice thick with hatred. But he didn't move to charge again. Instead, he looked over his shoulder, his hand still clutching the knife, his eyes narrowing in on Mark. Mark didn't hesitate. "Run!" he shouted at the twins, who had been frozen with fear behind him. The girls didn't need any further urging. Without a word, they bolted toward the trees, their footsteps light in the snow as they scrambled to safety. Ruth, still carrying the baby in her arms, was close behind them. Mark watched them go, every part of him screaming to follow, but he knew they were safe for now. He had to hold the line. He had to keep the threat away. The man in the coat staggered to his feet, the blood from his wound staining the snow beneath him. His eyes locked onto Mark with a new intensity, as if he were sizing up his opponent. The game had changed. Mark wasn't just a soldier now, he was a protector. "You're making a mistake," the man spat. "You can't protect them forever. The fight's not over. You'll all pay for standing in my way." Mark's pulse quickened, but he didn't move. "I don't care," he said, his voice steady, his eyes cold with resolve. "I'll fight until my last breath to keep them safe." The K9 stood beside him, its growl low and threatening, ready to spring into action at the slightest command. The man seemed to hesitate for a moment, then reached into his coat again. Mark didn't wait for the next move. He fired again, the shot ringing out loud and clear, hitting the man square in the chest. The man collapsed backward, his knife slipping from his hand as he hit the snow. The K9 barked, moving forward cautiously, but the threat was over. Mark didn't lower his rifle. He stood still, scanning the area, his heart pounding in his chest, waiting for the next move. But nothing came. It was over, for now. Mark turned toward the girls, his breath coming in short bursts as he made his way back to them. His body ached with the exertion, his muscles stiff from the cold and the fight, but the adrenaline kept him moving. He had done what he promised. They were safe. The twins were huddled together by the trees, Ruth standing beside them, looking back with a mix of gratitude and relief. "Are you okay?" Mark asked, his voice hoarse. Ruth nodded, her face pale but determined. "We're okay for now, but we need to keep moving." Mark looked back at the fallen man, then at the girls. "Let's go. We can't stay here." The group moved quickly, moving deeper into the forest, the storm still howling around them. The snow crunched beneath their boots, the trees bending under the weight of the storm. But they kept moving, knowing the danger was far from over. "Before we begin, let me know where you are watching from. Leave your country name in the comments below. And if you love stories about courage, loyalty, and community, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next stories." Mark's heart was heavy with the weight of what they had survived, but deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. The world had already taken so much from these girls, and he wasn't about to let it take anything else. "Please don't send me back," the younger twin whispered to Mark as they moved, her voice filled with fear. Mark's heart ached as he turned toward her. He reached out a hand to comfort her, his eyes filled with the determination to protect her no matter what. "I won't," he promised, his voice steady and sure. "I swear you're safe with me." But as they pushed forward into the storm, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that their real fight was only just beginning. The storm raged on, the wind howling through the trees, but Mark didn't stop. His eyes scanned the snow-covered forest, his grip tightening on his rifle as he moved alongside the twins and Ruth. The threat they had just faced felt like a distant memory, but Mark knew better. The worst wasn't over. They had barely covered any ground when Ruth turned to him, her face etched with worry. "Do you think they're still following us?" Mark didn't answer right away. He could hear the crackling of the snow under their boots, but the stillness of the forest was unsettling. He had learned long ago to trust his instincts, and right now they were telling him they weren't safe yet. "They're not far behind," Mark said quietly, keeping his voice steady. "We need to keep moving." The K9, Rex, was ahead, its paws sinking into the thick snow, its body coiled and alert. The dog had always been a step ahead, scanning the surroundings, sensing things Mark couldn't. Ruth glanced at him, her hand still tightly clutching Maya's. "How far do you think we can go before they catch up?" Mark's heart clenched. Ruth was asking a question he didn't have the answer to. He had no doubt they were being hunted. Keen wouldn't let them go so easily. But they had no choice but to push on. The twins' safety depended on it. "Not much farther," Mark said finally. "But we'll make it. We'll find a place to hide." They pressed on, the trees thickening around them as the storm intensified. The path was treacherous, snow and ice made each step a struggle, but Mark moved as fast as he could, urging the others to keep up. Every few steps he would glance over his shoulder, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The quiet was unnerving. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, as if the forest itself was waiting for something to happen. After what felt like hours, they came to a small clearing. Mark signaled for them to stop. His eyes flicked to the left, where the trees formed a natural barrier. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. "Get under the trees," he whispered to Ruth and Maya. "Stay low." "Stay quiet." Ruth nodded, her face pale but determined. She pulled Maya into the small grove of trees, the baby still nestled in her arms. Mark watched them disappear into the shelter, then turned his attention back to the forest. Rex was already scouting, moving through the snow with the silent grace of a predator. Mark could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. They were close now. Too close. His grip on his rifle tightened as he listened for the sound of footsteps, the subtle rustling of the snow. He knew Keen's men would be moving in quickly. They would be closing in on them. Suddenly, a faint sound reached his ears. It was soft at first, just the crunch of snow. Then louder, the distinct rhythm of boots against snow getting closer, closer. Mark's pulse quickened. He motioned to Rex. The dog stopped, its ears pricked, eyes narrowing as it tracked the sound. Mark leaned in, his breath catching in his throat. The wind howled again, but this time it was different. There was a distinct noise coming from the east, like a low, dragging hum. "Rex, stay alert," Mark murmured, his voice barely a whisper. Ruth's voice broke through the tension. "Mark, what's happening?" Mark didn't look at her. His eyes were locked on the trees ahead where shadows moved in the distance. "They're coming," he said grimly. Ruth gasped. "How many?" Mark didn't answer. He couldn't afford to waste time calculating. Keen's men were too close now. His only thought was to protect the girls, get them to safety, even if it cost him everything. He moved quickly, crouching low behind a snowbank, his body tense and ready for what was to come. The twins and Ruth had found cover behind a small rise, and Mark took a moment to make sure they were hidden. They were safe for now. A flicker of movement caught his eye. Mark's heart skipped a beat as he saw one of Keen's men. The soldier was moving cautiously, his rifle scanning the trees ahead, but he hadn't seen Mark yet. It was a risk, but Mark knew he had no choice. He slowly raised his rifle, his finger tightening on the trigger. The soldier moved closer, his boots crunching in the snow, oblivious to the danger that was waiting for him. Just as the soldier stepped into the clearing, Mark fired. The shot was clean, silent, but effective. The soldier collapsed to the ground, his rifle tumbling away into the snow. Mark's heart was pounding, but there was no time to celebrate. He turned toward the direction the rest of Keen's men would be coming from. The storm was growing fiercer, the wind now howling so loudly that it drowned out the sound of footsteps. Mark's mind raced as he scanned the area, looking for the best possible route. There was no way they could stay here. They had to keep moving, but they needed to be quick. "Ruth," Mark called out, his voice low but urgent. "It's time." "We're moving out now." Ruth nodded, her face pale but resolute. She took Maya's, hand, pulling her close as they moved toward Mark's position. The K9 barked again, its tail wagging once before it moved to the front, signaling the way forward. But as they began to move, Mark's heart skipped a beat. There, just beyond the trees, were the unmistakable silhouettes of more soldiers. Keen's men. Mark's grip tightened on his rifle. His chest tightened with the realization that the battle was far from over. Keen was getting closer, and there was no escaping him now, but before he could make a move, Maya's voice broke through the air, soft but clear. "Please don't send me back." The words hung in the cold air, and Mark froze. He looked down at the little girl, her eyes wide and filled with a pleading that made his chest tighten. "I won't," Mark whispered, kneeling down beside her. His hand gently touched her shoulder. "I promise, I won't let them take you." He could hear the sound of the soldiers drawing closer, but in that moment, all Mark could think about was keeping his promise. He had come this far. He wouldn't fail her now. The soldiers were close now, too close. Mark could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, the cold air stinging his face as he kept his eyes locked on the advancing figures. His rifle was raised, his body tense, every muscle coiled with anticipation. This wasn't just a fight for survival anymore, it was a fight for the safety of the twins, for Ruth, for the promise he had made. The K9 stood beside him, its body still and focused, its growl deep in its throat as it watched the soldiers carefully. Rex was ready, as always, but even the most loyal companions couldn't fight an entire army alone. "Stay low," Mark whispered to Ruth, who had Maya close to her chest, her face grim with determination. "We're going to have to make a run for it, but we need to be quick." "Don't stop for anything." Ruth nodded silently, her grip tightening on Maya's hand. She had always been strong, but Mark could see the fear in her eyes. The world had been unforgiving to them both, but the look in Ruth's eyes was one of a mother who would protect her child at all costs. They were running out of time. Mark's gaze shifted back to the soldiers, their silhouettes slowly moving through the snow, their rifles raised as they searched for any sign of life. They were getting closer. Mark could feel the tension in the air, every second dragging on like an eternity. The sound of their boots crunching in the snow echoed in the silence, growing louder with each step. He couldn't afford to wait any longer. "Move!" Mark shouted, his voice commanding. His feet were already in motion as he sprinted toward the trees, the K9 bounding ahead, its paws cutting through the thick snow with ease. Ruth hesitated for just a moment, looking back toward the direction where the soldiers had been closing in. She could feel the weight of the moment, the panic, rising in her chest, but she took a deep breath and followed Mark. Maya clung to her, and Ruth ran, keeping her daughter close, her legs moving as fast as they could through the deep snow. Mark's heart raced as he pushed forward, his breath coming in sharp, visible gasps as he cut through the snow. Every part of his body screamed for rest, for a moment to breathe, but there was no time. The storm was still raging, the wind howling around them like a constant reminder of the danger that awaited them. He had to get them out of here, and fast. The soldiers were still behind them. He could hear their voices, the sound of the snow crunching beneath their boots, the crackle of their radios. They were closing in. But Mark didn't stop. He couldn't. He would do whatever it took to protect these girls. The forest was dense, the trees thick with snow, and Mark knew they could use the environment to their advantage. If they could make it to the river, they might have a chance of losing the soldiers, but the distance between them and the river was still far, and Keen's men were relentless. Mark glanced over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the distance. The soldiers were almost within range now, their figures just visible through the snowstorm. It wouldn't be long before they saw the group. "Keep going," Mark called out, his voice low but urgent. He didn't have time to explain. They just had to keep moving. Ruth's breath came in ragged gasps, but she kept pace, her determination unwavering. Maya's small hand was tight in hers, and Ruth glanced down at her daughter, her heart breaking at the sight of the little girl's innocent face, eyes wide with fear. But then something changed. The world seemed to slow. Ruth felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. She didn't know where it came from, but it settled deep within her chest. The storm howled around them, but she kept moving, her legs carrying her forward with newfound strength. Maya was depending on her. She couldn't let her down. Mark was still ahead, his rifle raised, his eyes constantly scanning for any sign of danger. His shoulders were tense, his body exhausted, but his resolve never wavered. He had been through so much, yet here he was, fighting not just for survival, but for something more, something that meant everything. "Stay close," Mark called, his voice cutting through the wind as he motioned for Ruth and Maya to catch up. "We're almost there." But as they pushed forward, a shout rang out from behind them. One of the soldiers had spotted them. "There they are!" the soldier yelled. "Don't let them escape!" Mark spun around, his rifle raised, eyes narrowed in focus. His heart pounded, adrenaline surging through his body as he fired at the advancing soldiers, hitting one in the leg. The soldier went down with a cry, but Mark couldn't afford to celebrate. The others were still coming. Ruth's eyes widened as the first shot rang out. She ducked instinctively, pulling Maya close to her. The sound of gunfire echoed through the trees, making her stomach twist with fear. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. She had to keep moving, had to get Maya to safety. Mark didn't wait for the soldiers to regroup. He motioned for Ruth and Maya to run, and they did, running as fast as they could through the thick snow. The storm seemed to grow even fiercer, the wind biting into their skin, but Mark didn't let up. "Go!" he shouted again, his voice hoarse with urgency. They pushed through the snow, the distance to the river narrowing, but Mark could hear the soldiers catching up. The sound of their pursuit was unmistakable, loud, relentless. Mark's heart was racing in his chest as he pushed forward, his legs burning, his breath coming in ragged gasps. But the river was just ahead. The snow-covered ground sloped down toward the bank, and Mark felt a surge of hope. They were almost there. They could lose the soldiers in the water. "Almost there," Mark called, his voice filled with determination. The K9 barked sharply, its body moving faster as it led the way. But then Mark heard something that made his blood run cold, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind them, faster now. He turned, just in time to see one of Keen's soldiers leap toward them, his rifle aimed directly at Mark. But before the soldier could fire, the K9 lunged, knocking the soldier to the ground with a deafening growl. Mark didn't hesitate. He fired again, hitting the soldier in the chest, but the K9 was already moving, protecting its handler, keeping Mark and the girls safe. "Move!" Mark shouted, his voice hoarse. "Keep going!" Ruth and Maya didn't need any more urging. They bolted toward the river, the roar of the water growing louder as they neared the bank. And then, with one last burst of energy, they reached the river. The river roared beneath the weight of the storm. The snow that had been falling heavily now turned to ice, swirling in vicious gusts of wind, but Mark didn't flinch. The roar of the water drowned out everything else, the distant shouts of soldiers, the howl of the wind, and the cold that threatened to overtake him. He couldn't afford to focus on that now, his eyes locked on the riverbank ahead, where safety seemed just within reach. "Keep moving!" Mark shouted over his shoulder to Ruth, his voice hoarse and strained. She was close, so close. Her face was pale with exhaustion, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she pushed herself forward, her daughter, Maya, held tightly in her arms. The K9, Rex, was ahead, its powerful legs cutting through the snow with remarkable speed, guiding the way across the icy terrain. Mark had never trusted anyone as much as he trusted Rex, and right now the dog was their lifeline. Maya, clutching her teddy bear tightly, stumbled slightly, but Ruth steadied her, whispering words of encouragement. They had been through so much already, and yet Mark could see the fire in Ruth's eyes, the determination that kept them moving, step by step. "Ruth!" Mark shouted again, his eyes darting behind them. We need to move faster, they're closing in! Ruth's face twisted in determination as she nodded, pushing forward with renewed urgency, her gaze fixed on the icy waters ahead. They couldn't stop, not yet. Mark fired a shot over his shoulder, catching the first soldier who had been in pursuit. The man staggered, collapsing in the snow, but there was no time to celebrate. Mark could see more soldiers emerging from the trees, their dark figures emerging from the storm like shadows, relentless and unforgiving. "We're almost there," Mark muttered to himself, his voice a whisper against the wind. His legs burned with the effort, his body aching from the cold and the battle they had just fought. But he couldn't slow down now. They couldn't afford to be caught. He turned and moved toward the edge of the river, his rifle raised, eyes scanning the area for danger. The current roared beneath him, and the freezing water was just inches away. They were so close to safety. Just one more push, but then he heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind him, faster now. A soldier had followed them to the edge of the river, determined to stop them. Mark didn't hesitate. He spun around, his rifle raised, firing a shot that struck the soldier in the shoulder, sending him tumbling backward into the snow. But Mark couldn't afford to stop. There were more soldiers coming, and they weren't far behind. They needed to be across the river, away from the trees, before Keen's men had a chance to catch up. "Go!" Mark shouted to Ruth, his voice breaking. "Get Maya across the river, now!" Ruth didn't hesitate. She grabbed Maya's hand and pulled her toward the water, her face pale but resolute. Mark knew they had no time to waste. He looked down at Rex, who was already halfway across the riverbank, its powerful paws cutting through the ice. The dog barked once, as if to remind Mark that there was still time to escape. Mark turned back to the soldiers, his rifle raised. There were at least 5 men still advancing, and they were getting too close. He couldn't hold them off for much longer, not with his strength draining. His shoulder ached, and the blood from his wounds was beginning to freeze in the cold, but he didn't stop. He fired again, hitting the second soldier in the leg. The man fell with a grunt, but Mark could already hear more soldiers closing in from the other side. He had to get across the river too, but the soldiers weren't done. One of them broke free from the group and ran toward Mark, raising his rifle. Mark aimed, but before he could fire, Rex lunged, tackling the soldier to the ground with a force that sent them both tumbling into the snow. The K9 growled fiercely, his jaws clamping around the soldier's arm, holding him in place. Mark didn't wait for the struggle to finish. He turned and ran for the water, the icy cold slapping his face as he plunged into the river. The current was stronger than he expected, and he felt his legs buckle beneath him as the cold seeped into his bones. But he kept moving, the roar of the water pushing him forward, his rifle still clutched in his hand. Behind him he could hear the sound of Ruth and Maya struggling through the river as well, their voices faint in the chaos of the storm. But the soldiers were still coming. Mark could hear their boots crunching against the snow, the sounds growing louder with every passing second. There wasn't enough time. They needed to get to the other side, away from the river, where the trees could offer them cover. "Ruth!" Mark called out, his voice hoarse with the effort. "Hurry!" "They're right behind us." Ruth's voice rang back, filled with desperation. "We're almost there." Mark could barely make out her figure through the snowstorm, but he could hear the strain in her voice. She was almost across, just a little further. And then, with one final push, Ruth and Maya reached the opposite bank, her hand still tightly gripping her daughter's, pulling her up onto the shore. The K9 barked once, its tail wagging as it bounded toward them, ensuring they were safely across. Mark was right behind them, struggling to pull himself out of the river, his hands numb from the cold. He staggered onto the snow-covered bank, his body trembling from the freezing water, his breath coming in shallow gasps. But as he turned to look at the river, he realized something. The soldiers were no longer pursuing them. They had stopped at the edge of the water, hesitant, unwilling to follow them into the freezing current. Mark collapsed onto the snow, gasping for air, his body completely drained. He could barely keep his eyes open. But as he looked up, he saw Ruth and Maya, standing just a few feet away, their faces filled with relief. The worst of it was over for now. Maya, still clutching her teddy bear tightly, took a hesitant step toward Mark, her small voice trembling with gratitude. "Thank you for saving us." Mark smiled weakly, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're safe now." That's all that matters. As the storm raged around them, Mark felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of peace. Despite everything they had gone through, despite the fight and the pain, they had made it. They were alive. And for now, that was enough. The snowstorm howled around them, the wind biting at their exposed skin as Mark, Ruth, and the twins trudged deeper into the forest. The river behind them was now a distant roar, its icy waters a barrier that had, for the moment, kept Keen's soldiers at bay. But Mark knew the danger wasn't over. Keen's men wouldn't stop. They never did. Ruth looked over her shoulder, her face pale with worry. "Are we safe?" Her voice was thin, strained, as though every step she took had drained the last bit of energy from her. Mark didn't answer immediately. He was too busy watching the trees, scanning the shadows of the snow-covered forest for any movement. Rex, his loyal K9, moved ahead of them, its ears perked, nostrils flaring as it sniffed the air, searching for any sign of danger. "We're safe for now," Mark said finally, his voice hoarse, but his expression grim. "But we can't stop. They'll be looking for us. We need to keep moving." The twins, Maya and her sister, had been unusually quiet since the escape from the river. Maya clutched her teddy bear tightly, her small hand tucked in Ruth's, and the other twin clung to her mother's side, her eyes wide with fear. Mark's heart twisted at the sight of them, two little girls too young to understand the full weight of the world on their shoulders, yet forced to endure so much. They hadn't asked for this life. They hadn't asked to be alone, hungry, scared. But they were here now, and it was up to him to protect them. Mark paused for a moment, his breath shallow from the cold, his ribs aching with every movement. His side throbbed from the wound he'd taken earlier, but he pushed through the pain. He couldn't afford to stop. Not yet. Ruth stopped too, turning to look at him. "How much farther do we have to go?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with worry. She had barely said a word since they had crossed the river, the weight of what had just happened settling heavily on her shoulders. "We can't stop until we find shelter," Mark said. "The forest should provide us cover." "But we need to find a place to rest before the night falls." Mark scanned the horizon once more, his eyes darting between the trees. He had no way of knowing how far they had come or how much farther they had to go before the next threat appeared. They could be walking right into the jaws of another trap. But right now, all he could do was keep moving, keep them moving. "Can we go faster?" Ruth asked, her face hard with determination. "The girls are exhausted." Mark's eyes softened as he glanced down at Maya, her tiny face drawn with exhaustion, her legs slow from the cold. He knew it was hard for her to keep up, but they didn't have the luxury of time. Keen's men would be closing in. Mark knew they couldn't outrun them forever. "Not much longer," Mark said, trying to reassure Ruth and the twins. But he knew it wasn't true. The truth was they didn't have much time at all. The soldiers were relentless, and they had left too many traces of their passage in the snow. It wouldn't take long for Keen's men to pick up their trail again. Ruth sighed, her breath visible in the cold air. I just want them to be safe," she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. She looked down at Maya, who was still clutching her teddy bear, her small face buried in Ruth's coat. Mark didn't respond. What could he say? He understood her fear. He felt it too. The weight of his responsibility to keep them safe was starting to crush him, but he couldn't let it show. He couldn't afford to doubt himself now. They needed him to be strong, even if he didn't feel that way. "We'll find a place to rest soon," Mark said, his voice firm. "We'll get through this. We just need to keep moving." The forest around them seemed endless, the trees thick and tall, their bare branches creaking in the wind. The snow continued to fall, thick and heavy, but it was starting to settle, leaving the world blanketed in white. The path ahead was unclear, but Mark had no choice but to keep pushing forward, to keep hoping that somewhere, just beyond the next rise, they would find shelter. But the storm was growing stronger. The wind howled louder now, the snow thickening and swirling, making it harder to see. Mark's eyes squinted against the blinding whiteness, and he could feel the chill creeping into his bones. "We can't keep going like this," Ruth said, her voice barely audible over the storm. "We need a place to rest." "Please, Mark, we can't keep walking through this storm." Mark stopped for a moment, considering her words. He knew she was right. They couldn't keep going forever, not in these conditions. But they were so close to safety, or so it felt. The river was behind them, and the forest ahead was their only chance. "We'll find something soon," Mark said, though his own words felt hollow. He couldn't promise them much more than that. And then, as if the storm itself had answered his thoughts, he saw it, a small cabin, barely visible through the swirling snow, the outline of its roof peeking through the trees. Mark's heart surged with relief. Shelter. It was a long shot, but it was something. He motioned for Ruth to follow. "There," he said, his voice full of urgency. "We can take shelter there." Ruth didn't hesitate. She grabbed Maya's hand, pulling her along as they hurried toward the cabin. The canine, Rex, was already moving ahead, barking once before disappearing into the snow. Mark followed close behind, his rifle ready, his heart racing with the knowledge that this was their only chance. If this cabin was empty, if it was another trap, they might not make it through the night. But they had no choice. The storm was closing in, and Mark could feel the exhaustion weighing heavily on his shoulders. He had to believe they could make it. Ruth's voice, strained with relief, broke through the silence. "Mark, I think we've found it?" Mark's pulse raced as he saw the door of the cabin open slightly, the faintest light flickering from within. It was the first real sign of safety they had seen in hours. "Stay close," he said, his voice hoarse. "We're almost there." But as he stepped forward, a faint sound from behind them stopped him, cold. The unmistakable crunch of boots in the snow. "Mark," Ruth's voice quivered. "We're not alone, are we?" Mark turned, his eyes scanning the forest once more, and there they were, figures moving in the distance, the cold glint of rifles catching the light from the storm. They were too close. Mark's heart raced as he scanned the shadowy figures moving toward them through the snowstorm. His breath came in quick, shallow bursts, each one more labored than the last. They were so close now, so close to shelter, and yet the soldiers had found them again. He could feel the weight of his injuries, his side aching, his muscles stiff. But there was no time to slow down. The twins needed him, Ruth needed him, they all needed to escape. "Get inside!" Mark shouted to Ruth, his voice cutting through the howling wind. Ruth didn't hesitate. She grabbed Maya's hand and pulled her toward the small cabin, her steps quick and purposeful. Mark was right behind them, but as he took a step forward, the canine barked sharply. Rex's eyes were locked on the approaching soldiers, its hackles raised in warning. "Rex, stay!" Mark commanded, his voice steady despite the panic rising in his chest. Ruth and Maya were already inside the cabin, but Mark couldn't move until the canine gave him an opening. He had to make sure they were safe before anything else. The canine growled low, its body tense, but it didn't move. Mark glanced toward the soldiers again, their silhouettes growing clearer as they closed the distance. The sound of boots crunching in the snow sent a chill down his spine, and the weight of his rifle in his hands felt heavier than ever. The soldiers were getting closer, and Mark could see their guns raised. There were at least 5 of them, too many for Mark to fight off alone. He couldn't risk it, not with the girls so close. "Rex, get back!" Mark shouted, his voice filled with urgency. The canine hesitated for a moment, then backed off, allowing Mark to move toward the cabin. He didn't look back as he made his way to the door, his mind focused on getting Ruth and the twins to safety. The cabin's door creaked as he pushed it open, slipping inside just as the first shot rang out. The bullet missed, but Mark felt the sting of it in his gut, the force of the near miss knocking him off balance. He stumbled, but Ruth was there to steady him, her arms reaching out to pull him inside. "Mark," Ruth's voice was full of fear and concern as she helped him to the ground. Maya stood at her side, her eyes wide, fear evident in the way she clutched her teddy bear. "We need to move," Mark gasped, his breath shallow as he pushed himself back to his feet. "They're coming." "We can't stay here." But the cabin was small and they couldn't go anywhere else. Mark had known it was a gamble, but it was the only option they had. They'd been on the run for too long, and they had no choice but to fight for a few more moments of safety. The K9 barked outside, its growl low and ferocious, but Mark could hear the soldiers closing in, their footsteps crunching in the snow as they approached the cabin. It wouldn't be long before they were at the door. "Ruth," Mark said, his voice tight with urgency. "Get Maya to the back." "Stay low." Ruth nodded, her face pale with fear, but her expression firm. She didn't ask questions, she didn't hesitate. She grabbed Maya's hand and pulled her toward the back of the cabin, where they could hide behind the small woodpile. Mark kept his eyes on the door, his rifle steady in his hands. The storm outside had grown worse, but he couldn't let that distract him. The soldiers were getting closer, and he couldn't let them find Ruth and the twins. Not now. The door burst open with a sudden crash, and the first soldier stepped inside, rifle raised. Mark fired instinctively, hitting the man in the chest. The soldier collapsed with a grunt, but before Mark could react, another soldier stepped forward, a knife in hand. Mark barely had time to raise his rifle before the soldier lunged at him, knocking him to the ground. The soldier's weight pinned Mark's chest, and for a moment he struggled to breathe, the pressure of the man's body crushing him. But Mark didn't give up. He struggled against the soldier's weight, his hand gripping the rifle tightly as he twisted it upward. He fired again, hitting the soldier in the throat. The man let out a choking gasp and collapsed to the side, blood pooling on the floor. Mark pushed himself up, gasping for air. His chest burned, but he didn't have time to rest. There were still more soldiers outside, and he couldn't let them get to Ruth and the twins. He turned to the back of the cabin, his eyes scanning for any sign of movement. He could hear the soft sound of breathing from Ruth and Maya, hidden behind the woodpile. They were safe for now. "Stay low," Mark whispered, his voice rough. "I'm not letting them get to you." He turned back to the door, his rifle aimed at the next soldier who stepped into the cabin. But the door remained closed. The storm outside had grown worse, the wind howling like a banshee, but the silence inside the cabin was deafening. Mark's heart raced in his chest, his body trembling with exhaustion, but he stayed alert. He couldn't afford to let his guard down. Moments passed, and the door remained still. Mark's eyes narrowed, his instincts telling him something wasn't right. He raised his rifle, his body tense as he waited for the next move, and then a voice, cold and familiar, broke the silence. "Well, well, well. Looks like we've caught ourselves a rat." Mark's blood ran cold. It was Keen, the man who had been hunting them for so long, the man who wouldn't stop until he had what he wanted. Mark's grip tightened on his rifle as the door creaked open, and Keen stepped inside, his smirk almost too much to bear. Behind him, 2 more soldiers followed, their guns aimed directly at Mark. "It's over, Sergeant," Keen said, his voice low and menacing. "You've done all you can. Now it's time to give me what I want." Mark didn't respond. He couldn't. He was too tired, too broken to argue. But he wasn't about to give up, not while Maya and Ruth were still in the other room. "I won't let you have them," Mark said, his voice steady despite the weariness in his bones. "You'll have to kill me first." Keen's smirk faded, replaced with a cold, calculating look. "That can be arranged," he said. The sound of footsteps behind him broke the tension, and Mark's eyes widened as Rex lunged, its teeth bared, aiming for Keen's men. It was now or never. The sound of Rex's growl filled the cabin as it lunged toward Keen's men. Mark's heart hammered in his chest, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps as he scrambled to his feet, eyes locked on the soldiers. The K9's teeth sank into the arm of one of the soldiers, pulling him backward as the other man fumbled for his weapon. Keen's voice rang out, furious and cold. "Kill the dog! Kill them all!" Mark moved quickly, his rifle raised, his fingers cold but steady. He aimed at the soldier who had just managed to draw his gun, and in a fluid motion, fired. The soldier collapsed with a grunt, his rifle clattering to the floor as he fell to the ground. Rex was still on top of the other soldier, its jaws clamped around his arm, shaking him violently. The soldier yelled in pain, but he couldn't shake the dog off. Mark took advantage of the chaos, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the room. Keen hadn't moved, but his gaze was locked onto Mark, calculating, waiting for the right moment to strike. The soldier on the floor was out of the fight, but the remaining soldier drew his weapon, aiming directly at Mark. In the blink of an eye, Mark fired again, the shot ringing out with deafening precision. The soldier crumpled to the floor, his gun falling from his hand. But Keen was still standing. "You're not getting away this time," Keen sneered, his eyes cold with fury. He reached into his coat, pulling out a second, larger gun, aiming directly at Mark's chest. The world seemed to slow as Mark's heart raced. Every instinct screamed at him to duck, to move, but his body was frozen, his mind racing through every possible move. But then a sharp bark echoed through the room. Rex, having finished with the first soldier, darted toward Keen, its teeth bared. In a split second, Rex knocked Keen off balance, sending him crashing to the floor with a violent thud. The gun slipped from Keen's hand as he scrambled to regain his footing. Mark didn't waste a moment. He lunged toward Keen, his rifle raised, and with one final shot, the world went silent. Keen collapsed, his body still, the gunshot ringing in the air, echoing against the cabin's walls. Mark stood there, breathless, his chest heaving as he watched the man who had caused so much pain finally fall. But there was no time to savor the victory. They weren't safe yet. There was no telling how many more soldiers were still out there. Ruth and the twins emerged from the back of the cabin, their faces pale but relieved. Ruth's eyes met Mark's, and for a brief moment, everything seemed to freeze. There was no more danger. There was no more fighting. The storm outside had finally stopped, and for the first time in what felt like forever, they were safe. "Mark," Ruth whispered, her voice trembling with emotion as she reached out for him. "Are you okay?" Mark nodded, though his body screamed with exhaustion. The pain in his side was sharp, and his legs felt like they could give out at any moment. But he wasn't going to fall. Not now. Not when they were finally safe. He turned to look at the twins who were standing silently beside Ruth. Maya was clutching her teddy bear tightly, her face streaked with tears. Her sister, equally silent, stood with her hand in her mother's, her eyes wide with a mixture of relief and fear. "Are you two okay?" Mark asked softly, his voice rough from exhaustion. Maya nodded, her small voice barely a whisper. "We're okay." Mark felt a pang in his chest at the sight of them, so small and innocent, caught in the middle of this war that had never been theirs. He had promised to protect them, and now he had kept that promise. Ruth sat down beside him, wrapping her arms around the twins, pulling them close. She held them tightly as though she never wanted to let go. Mark watched the scene unfold in front of him, the quiet, tender moment, a stark contrast to the violence they had just endured. "We're going to be okay," Ruth said softly, more to herself than to anyone else. "We're going to be okay." Mark didn't say anything. He couldn't. His mind was still racing, still processing everything that had just happened. They had fought for their lives, fought for each other. And in the end, they had survived. But there was still one thing left to do. He looked down at Rex, who had already returned to his side, his loyal eyes watching Mark with unwavering trust. The canine had been with him through everything, and Mark knew that without Rex, this wouldn't have ended the way it did. "We made it," Mark whispered, his voice heavy with the weight of the moment. "We're not going back." The twins looked up at him, their faces still filled with the innocence of children who had witnessed more than they should have. But Mark could see the gratitude in their eyes. They were safe for now. And that was all that mattered. As the last of the storm passed, Mark turned to Ruth. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing: he wasn't going to let anything tear this family apart. They had fought too hard, and they had come too far. They had found each other in the most unlikely of places, and he would keep them safe, no matter what came next.